Great.
Okay. All right. Welcome to those of you that have already joined us this morning. We're going to do a little intro to tell you about SCORE in case you don't know, and then we're going to get started right away. So SCORE does two main important things for the small business community. One is training, and that training is done through webinars and workshops. We have scaled back webinars for the summer a little bit, but that doesn't mean the topics that we are giving this summer are less important. In fact, we have some really great topics this summer. So I strongly encourage you to watch for the newsletter or to go to the score.org website and you can pick your local area and find out what webinars we have coming up. The most important thing that SCORE does, however, is mentoring. Our mentors are volunteers that come to us with a wide variety of experience and knowledge to share with you, with the small business community. It's always free because they are volunteers, and it is confidential. We work with folks that are at all stages in the process. We work with those that are trying to decide if small business ownership is right for them. We're working with those in the planning phase, and we're working with those that are already in business. People come to us with questions on every topic you can imagine in the small business world, whether it's how do I track my books? How do I market? How do I brand? How do I sell? What's a cash flow? I mean, any topic you can imagine. So if you have a question about anything in business related to business, reach out to us. So you might be wondering, how do you do that? It is very, very easy. You can go to score.org and there's a little box for your zip code. You just put your zip code in and they will direct you to the chapter nearest you. Or you can just put a note to the host and panelists, so it's private, into chat, and we'll reach out to you and make sure the right chapter reaches out to you to answer your questions. So a few notes about today. We are recording, and I will put in chat where you can find that recording. And we will be turning the slides into a handout, and we will send those to those that attended today. I would anticipate we might have a few questions today, so we do prefer to use the Q&A tab on the Zoom bar for you to submit questions that you want to ask to our presenters. We will address those questions at the very end. If you have very specific questions about your business on this topic, it is really best that you meet privately with a mentor. If you have general questions, definitely throw them in that Q&A tab and we will get those answered at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to David and Bernie. They're both SCORE Boston mentors. And this is the first time topic for us. And we're very glad that they were able to bring this to you today. So turning it over to you, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name's David Coughlan. I've been a SCORE mentor now for a couple of years. I retired a couple of years ago after a career 40 plus years, primarily focused on commercial real estate. Have been involved in real estate investment, development, and management. And as part of that role, I have negotiated hundreds of leases, all as a landlord. So I bring that perspective to the table. So Bernie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I also have about 40 years in the real estate business, most of which has been in retail. I spent over 20 years at Staples, where I was involved in expanding that company across the country, hundreds of leases, and also worked on the landlord side for a few years for a real estate investment trust that owned about 100 shopping centers and malls. More recently worked with Planet Fitness franchisee, opening stores around the country, and then currently I'm working with another franchise concept for very small stores, about 2,000 square feet. So a lot of experience in a full range of types of real estate and sizes of stores. So with that, we'll get started.
So this workshop is primarily focused, as the title says, on retail leasing. But there's a lot of things we're going to talk about that are applicable to any other commercial uses, including offices, warehouses, et cetera. The other thing that has to be stressed, and we'll say this repeatedly, is we're not providing legal advice here. Neither Bernie or I are attorneys. All potential leases should be reviewed by an experienced real estate attorney. That's really, if there's one thing that you should come away from this this webinar, is thinking, if I get into a lease agreement, I'm going to need an attorney. So Bernie, why don't you start?
Okay, so I'm going to move on. You can see the topics that we'll be covering. So the first topic is how to decide it's time to lease space. And this obviously applies both, most of what we're saying applies to startups, but also could be relocation of existing businesses. And of course, first on everybody's mind is cost and how much can you afford. But I think the most important thing here is to make sure when you're considering cost, you have to consider that base rents that may be quoted is only one cost. All the other occupancy costs have to be considered, those being additional rent, or what's known as CAM and retail spaces, real estate taxes, and utilities. We'll get into much more about those in a little while. Of course, what size, and not just the size of space, but the type of space. Most businesses have a combination of open selling space as well as perhaps an office and storage, and you might even be able to reallocate some of that space to a different floor, like in a basement or a second level, to reduce your cost. Control, how long a lease term is right. Now, this really refers to the fact that especially for a startup business, you may not have real high confidence yet, and may not want to sign a very long-term lease, might want a shorter term lease, 3 or 5 years as opposed to 10. Most leasing today is going to be at least 5 to 10 years where it's desirable space. And generally there's options that you can negotiate beyond the initial term. And typically those options are for an equal period of time, perhaps, as your initial term. So if you have a 5-year initial term, most landlords will grant a 5-year option. Similarly, a 10-year initial term, perhaps 2 5-year options. Flexibility, this is a really important consideration, especially if you think your business is, after a startup phase, really could expand and you may want additional space. You could potentially pursue a right to expand in the location where you're leasing initially. If there's adjacent space, have the first option to take that space. The other flexibility you have to consider is, what if there's a failure, or even if you want to just relocate after a few years, what is your exit strategy? And there are ways potentially to build in options to get out of leases into leases. Not easy to do, frankly, but it is something that's worth exploring if that's important. And then there are a number of alternatives that you may want to consider, especially for a small startup concept, where you're really testing out a new business idea. Subletting space from an existing tenant who no longer needs that space, may have just a short term left. That might be ideal if the space can be modified for your needs with minimal investment. Really the key question for these options are, how much money you may need to invest, because these are all short-term options, and for businesses that require significant investment, they may not be good viable options. But a licensing space, you may be familiar, for example, inside Walmart. There's sometimes businesses that operate inside a Walmart. Those are typically under licenses, not sublets. And the key difference there is you really don't have total control of the space you're using. You're operating under the conditions that the primary tenant allows you to operate. Pop-ups are spaces where you literally can open for a few months at a time, perhaps. And then carts, we've all seen those, and like, for example, inside malls or in urban locations, street corners. And even co-working concept may work for some businesses. So next consideration is what type of location will be right for your business, and what are the location characteristics will be most important for your success. That's really what one should be thinking about. And here, this first bullet, location choice should properly serve a defined trade area based on your demographic profile. Virtually every business really needs to start by making sure it has a strong understanding of who the customers are. Seems obvious, but sometimes I think businesses are not as focused on that. So what that means is, what type of customer is going to be shopping in your location, and where are those customers with regard to the site you're going to choose? Because the trade area really is the definition of the geographic boundary most likely that will contain the vast majority of your customers. Where will they travel from to come to your location? Whether your location is accessed by foot, which you're most likely going to have a very small trade area, or by car, where you'd have a much larger trade area. It's really important to understand how large that is, and then to try to estimate, your business's potential to serve that trade area based on the demographics. So, for example, a new small children's clothing store, selling high price clothing, you're going to want to locate in an area where demographically you have high income families, and you want to make sure you have a good understanding of how many of those types of families are located in an area, and that would likely shop in that location. Opposite end of the spectrum might be, for example, a used furniture store that sells primarily to lower income customers or college students. You obviously want to look for a location there that meets that profile. Moving on, shopping patterns for your business. Most businesses really can be categorized as either a destination type retail business or an impulse business. What is the difference? Well, destination really means that for the most part, those customers have decided before they even leave their home or their business that they're coming to shop at your location. And they do that research today, maybe from advertising you're doing, but it's often done online. Examples of, a destination business, may be actually a furniture store is a good example. Most people only shop furniture rarely, once a year perhaps, and they've decided before they go, this is a store I want to visit. As opposed to an impulse, which would be most likely, for example, where am I going to eat lunch today? As I'm walking down the street, there might be, or driving down the street, there might be 3 or 4 choices. Location also should be, best understood, whether it's going to serve foot traffic or roadway traffic. Some locations could serve both, although in that case, location that relies heavily on foot traffic, but also people driving, needs to have available parking in relatively close proximity. Visibility, that's not just of your building, but also, signs both on the building as well as perhaps at the street on a pylon or a monument. Key considerations if you feel visibility is important to your success. Proximity to other businesses. What other businesses create traffic that will benefit you by customers seeing your business and potentially deciding to cross shop into yours? So most shopping centers, for example, will have what are known as the anchor tenants, perhaps a large supermarket and a typical grocery anchored center, or a whole lineup of larger retailers in what's known as a power center, or of course, in malls, those would be the main anchors. But you also want to pay attention to the proximity to competitors, and that may be both a positive and a negative. You may not want to be too close to some competitors, but in other cases, in furniture and in restaurants, often those are actually very good to be near where other people are already shopping for similar things that you're going to offer. And then access and egress and parking. When someone makes a decision to come to your business, you would generally want to make sure that they can get in and they can get out if they're driving, and that when they get there, they'll find a parking space. And, some shopping centers, spaces within shopping centers can have significant parking problems if the uses are such that they overwhelm the amount of parking. So it's something that you need to make sure you understand. And then my final point, which is ideally you want to pay for what's important to your success. What that means is different types of real estate obviously can be priced differently in terms of the rent. And, for example, locations that are, very prominent on the corner of a major roadway, highly visible, are generally going to be the most expensive. And that's great if that's what you need, but you don't necessarily want to pay the highest rent for a location if those factors, the visibility, for example, is not crucial to your success. Pass it back over to you, David.
Okay, so here I want to go into a little bit more detail about the different types of retail spaces that are available. The first one, a large shopping center, an enclosed mall, or sometimes now they are called lifestyle centers, where it's a large open air mall. This is typically going to be the most expensive option for leasing space. And here, the quality and the draw of the anchors and the major tenants is critical, because the way these buildings work, basically, they don't charge a lot of money to the large anchor tenants under the theory that they're going to make their money from the small tenants, such as yourselves, who are going to take advantage of the draw of the anchors. Now, we've all seen malls where, at one point Sears or Kmart might have been a large draw, but things change over time. So it's just important to be careful about that. In a large shopping center, location is key. It's really easy to get buried in a large center. So you have to be careful about being on a dead end, for example, or being in a location where you don't get to take advantage of the draw from the other tenants. In a large shopping center, you're going to be required to help pay for marketing. So that's different than most street level retail, for example, but they'll have some type of marketing and promotional fund that your lease is going to require you to participate in and pay for. So it's important to understand that up front. Much of what you do in a mall is going to be determined by the shopping center's rules and regulations. So that's another thing that's important to understand, such as your hours of operation, what you're allowed to put in your windows, things like that. The other most important thing in a mall is can you get potential exclusivity for your use? So if you're going to sell paper supplies, can you get the exclusive for being the only tenant in the building that sells paper supplies? That's important. If you can get it, landlords don't like to give those things. Next, it would be a neighborhood strip center. Parking is usually not as much of an issue in a center like this. Some centers are going to restrict high parking demand uses, which typically they would think of as restaurants or high parking demand. So it's important to understand what the parking situation is, and is it going to be easy for your customers, as Bernie was talking about earlier. And as Bernie mentioned, you want to make sure the other tenants in a neighborhood center are complementary and not necessarily competitive, unless, as he said, as an example, retail or restaurants rather. It's often helpful to have other restaurants in the same location. Most of my experience in retail has been on street level retail, where it might be an office building with upper and lower retail available on the lower level. I did a lot of work in Back Bay. Some streets are much better than others. So this goes to the question of how much visibility you need. You're going to pay for more visibility. You're going to pay to be on what's considered a better block than other blocks. Just, that's something important to remember, is that a better block of street level retail with high visibility is going to be more money. One of the issues with street level retail is parking can be a challenge. Now, it may be that your trade area and demographics that you've looked at, that parking isn't as big a deal, that you're more thinking you're going to draw from within a neighborhood, so parking is not as much of an issue. But if parking is a concern, then street level retail space can be challenging, especially in a city like Boston. And then you do get, some spaces might be multi-level, where you might enter on one level and then go up a set of stairs to get to the other level. Understand that that creates some issues with staffing, because if you have multiple levels in a store, you're typically going to want to have staff, at least one staff person on each level, to prevent shoplifting, things like that. You can't have a level of a store which has no staff people on it, because then you're leaving yourself open for that. The other thing on street level retail, which is important, is you're not going to have any control over what other landlords that are adjacent to you bring in for tenants. So whereas in a shopping center or a strip mall, you might be able to control what competition comes in, you're not going to be able to do that in street level retail. So that's an important consideration if that's something you're worried about. And then the other thing to mention is space licenses or co-working space. There are a lot of options for new startup tenants that are coming, at least in the city of Boston, where there's the availability to lease small amounts of space within what somebody else has leased as a larger co-working type of retail environment. There's a bunch of those down in the Seaport. There's some of those happening in Boston. So those are opportunities to maybe try out a concept that you haven't, that you're not sure if it's ever going to fly, but it's a good opportunity to get started. I've had a lot of restaurant clients come to me through SCORE, and particularly in the city of Boston, restaurants are a unique challenge. The way the city's zoning works, basically restaurant use is not pre-approved anywhere. So even if you're leasing a space that was a restaurant before, that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be approved for restaurant use again. It does help. It's obviously easier to go into permitting if you can point to previous restaurant use and say it's already been that way before. And building systems typically will be already in place for restaurant use, such as grease traps. Sometimes there's a lot of equipment, but you have to be concerned about the condition of that equipment. But if you can step into an existing restaurant with existing equipment that's in good condition, that's obviously a bonus for you, because you don't have to spend as much money up front. One of the things you're going to need to address with restaurants in any location is how you're going to address deliveries and trash removal, because that's something not only do landlords care a lot about, but neighborhoods care a lot about that as well. So that's something that's very important. So now let's talk about how you find the right space, because this can be a challenge, especially for a new business that maybe hasn't had a retail location before. There are various listing services and sources of information online that are available. The most prominent is a service called LoopNet. LoopNet will allow you to create an account on it, and you can search for listings for different types of space and different sizes of space within a market area. Typically, those listings are placed by commercial brokers. LoopNet does try to limit how much space you can see without paying. They do want you to pay for their service, even though they charge brokers money to place their listings on there. So one of the things I've always done is on my browser, if I'm looking at things on LoopNet, I will use a private window. So it doesn't necessarily track you every time you go and look at listings on the space. There are other services, Commercial Cafe, CRE, XI. Again, a lot of these are listings that are put on there by commercial brokers. The other thing to look at is the brokers' websites themselves. All good-sized commercial brokers will have extensive listings on their website, and it will have contact information for people to, if you see a piece of space that you think might be interesting, it'll have the name of who you should contact and the phone number, et cetera. Craigslist is another source of looking at finding space. There's a lot of scams on Craigslist, which everybody knows. So be very careful about Craigslist, and never send money to anybody over Craigslist without having seen a piece of space. So the easiest way to find space is going to be working with brokers, commercial brokers. So one of the things that's going to be important, and this is my second bullet point, I should have made it my first, is as a new business, you're going to need to demonstrate to the brokers you're looking to spend time and effort helping you. You're going to need them to understand that you're worth their investment, that you've done your homework, you know who your target audience is, you know where your customers are coming from, you know you're going to want to demonstrate that you've got some financial viability, that you have capital available to put down money for a security deposit, to pay the rent, et cetera, you know, that a landlord's going to accept you as a tenant. So that's one of your first goals, is going to be working with brokers, is going to be to demonstrate that you're worth their investment. Because if they don't think you're worth their investment, they're going to think you're wasting their time, and they're not going to really give you any good information or leads on space. You know, you should almost think of it as preparing a summary business plan for the brokers. Not in huge detail, but enough so that they think you're worth the while. Brokers are paid by the landlord, so you won't have to pay for a broker's work. They're going to get paid by the landlord. But understand that also gives them some, that gives them some conflict of interest inherent, because they're getting paid by the landlord. Good brokers understand and will they'll do the best job they can for tenants, because they know that's where it's important that they have more tenants come in and that you give referrals to other people, you know. So that's something that's important. In looking at brokers, you know, selecting which broker to talk to, you know, the first thing that's important is who has the most listings in your target area. If you're thinking you want to locate a store in Somerville, for example, in Davis Square, one of the things you're going to want to understand is who is the broker with the most listings in that area, because they're going to be the ones that both know what's available now. They're also going to be available off-market opportunities, things that haven't necessarily come up yet. They're going to be the ones that know, oh, I know this tenant is planning on leaving. This tenant's already given their notice to a landlord, so that space is going to be available in 5 months. Good brokers will be available of off-market opportunities. And one of the things you want to be careful about is brokers who only want to show you listings that they have exclusives on, that they don't want to bother showing you space that they don't have exclusive listings on. That's not going to be helpful for you. You want a broker who's going to take you not only to things they have listings on, but for things other brokers have listings on or landlords have not retained a broker for. The key sense with a broker is to get a sense of what the market is in your target area. Brokers will give you good information to help make sure you're not overpaying for your space, and they will help you negotiate a lease that is right for your business. Bernie?
Yep. Okay, so that takes us to the leasing process. You found a broker, you want to get started. So you really need to start by informing your broker what you're going to be looking for. And then you're going to start looking at spaces. So how do you start? Well, there are a number of things you're going to be interested in for your space, but you really should start out with a strong idea of which criteria are absolutely must-haves as opposed to those that are nice to have. So starting with use, well, as David mentioned, restaurants are a particular concern in some jurisdictions because the use is not always allowed everywhere for a number of reasons. So you want to make sure that the use that you have is allowed in the spaces you're looking for. The availability of the space, it may be vacant, so it seems obvious it's available, but you're often going to be offered space that has an operating tenant in it, and the landlord perhaps promising, oh, no problem, we'll have it vacant by the time you want it. But that's something that you need to know. If you have a key date that you need to be open by, making sure that space is available will be important. The frontage, meaning the width of the space, the depth and the ceiling height. I think it's important, especially for a new concept, to actually lay out on paper or pre-design, perhaps with the help of a space planner or an architect, what an ideal space would look like for your business and lay it out. And then inevitably you'll have to look at spaces that don't exactly meet the ideal, but it will be close enough. For example, when I was leasing Staples stores, our prototype was 120 feet wide, but we would often be forced to look at spaces as narrow as, say, 85, 90 feet. For an ideal location, a site that we felt was perfect in every other way, we would take a space much narrower and compromise on the layout of the store. So that's one of those examples of what's most important. It may be, in your case, that having at least, say, 20 feet of width for a small shop is absolutely minimally necessary. And it's important for your broker to know that in advance. The condition of the space and the availability of utilities, generally that's just a matter of cost. And if you have the capital, you can take space perhaps in any condition. But if you don't, then that's going to be a significant limit to spaces you're able to look at. Or if a landlord's not willing to invest to make it work for you, that's also going to be a significant limitation. Parking, which we've already talked about, making sure that there's adequate parking for the space, visibility and signage, again, what we've already talked about. And often signage is also subject to permitting. I think we'll be getting into that in more detail. So you can't always assume that you can get whatever you want on a building. So those are questions you'll need to ask and make sure your broker's aware of how important those things are to you up front. And then again, compatibility with the co-tenants, as David mentioned, and exclusivity. If those are key to your success, you need to make sure your broker's aware of that. So the ideal is, your broker understands your business well enough and screens out sites so that you're not wasting time looking at things that are never going to work for you. That's part of the broker's job, is to help save you time and only show you things that really could work. And the next point I can't stress too much, which is to tour locations multiple times, especially at those times where you are expecting your business to be drawing the most of its customers. So if you have a business which is going to be busy weekdays, noon hour, you want to make sure you understand what that location is like, especially for parking, for example. If it's a really busy shopping center, you may find at key times that you want to be open, parking lot's just jammed. For foot traffic, that's also crucial. And understanding how a site will look and feel at night, if you're going to be open into the late hours, is really important as well. So then the next step will be to solicit proposals from landlords based on these criteria that you deem most important. So the letter of intent negotiating process really varies tremendously, and a lot of, I'd say, worked with literally hundreds of landlords and tenants, and there are a lot of different approaches to it. Some prefer to have a very, very brief, what's known as a term sheet, which may include just a handful of terms like the rent, the term, options, and a few other things. And then others prefer to negotiate what's almost virtually a short form lease. Could be several pages long with significant detail about virtually everything that's going to be in a lease. I think that depends a lot on the type of business, and especially the amount of investment that either a landlord or tenant may have to put into the space before a lease starts. I think the bigger commitment of dollars probably leads one to have a much more detailed letter of intent. But crucial is, I strongly recommend that you include your broker for sure, and perhaps even your attorney at the letter of intent stage, to make sure you're not agreeing to something that you'll regret. Even though a letter of intent is just that, non-binding, once it's in paper and you've signed it, it becomes very difficult to change your mind and move off and try to revise the terms after the fact. That could end up killing a deal, as a landlord may decide they can't trust you.
Yeah, landlords hate that.
Yes, they really hate that. So what are the key terms? So legal entity, if it's a new business, this may be a LLC you haven't even formed yet, that you will need to identify what your intent is there, or if it's going to be a sole proprietorship, that's fine, or maybe you already have an existing business. But the landlord needs to know who are they leasing the space to. Security deposit and personal guarantee. Typically, you're not going to want to offer that, but landlord's almost certainly going to ask for and demand a security deposit, at least a month, maybe longer, for smaller, even existing businesses that are fairly significant in terms of their value. Often have to put up security deposits today. And personal guarantees are pretty much standard as well for small businesses. And the goal would be, if you can, to negotiate to reduce the security deposit, if not remove it entirely after a period of time. On a 10-year lease, perhaps after 5 years, you've paid the rent every month on time. Landlord may agree to reduce or eliminate a security deposit. Very rare, at least in my experience, a personal guarantee is ever going to go away, but it's certainly worth trying. Perhaps in an option period, it could go away if you've been, a great tenant for the duration of your initial term. Obviously, the LOI needs to include very specifically the space that you want to lease, and it's amazing how many times I've seen LOIs where the dimensions aren't indicated. It's nice to know exactly what you're getting. You really want to be sure that you understand that this, and ideally have actually measured the space yourself or with an architect. Of course, the base rent will be identified, but then there will be what's known as additional rent, and sometimes percentage rent. So base rent, there's typically going to be there could be any number of ways base rent's handled. It could be an annual escalation, often 2 or 3% per year. It's common, especially during an inflationary period like we're in today. Larger, stronger tenants typically can negotiate 3 or 5 years at a level rent and the base rent, and then have increases, perhaps 10 to 15% increase every 5 years, including the option periods. In terms of the additional rent, again, in shopping centers, the term CAM is thrown around. It means common area maintenance, and that refers to the cost the landlord incurs to maintain the property, parking lots, the landscaping, providing lighting, perhaps security, so on. But the landlord will try to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, in there, including maintenance of the buildings, perhaps capital investments in the buildings, replacing parking lots, replacing roofs. And David will get into a lot more detail on that when we get to the lease negotiation review. Real estate taxes attributable to the space, and insurance attributable to space. And so the tenant is essentially allocated a portion of all those costs based on a pro rata the size of the space relative to the total amount of space in the shopping center. One of the goals in a negotiation of those fees would be, one, to limit the amount of capital expenditures the landlord can pass through and the types of expenditures, and as well as management fees or admin fees. Pretty common to have a 10 to 15% add-on for basically to reimburse the landlord for their costs of managing all these aspects of owning the shopping center. And then finally, ideally, you want to negotiate a cap so you're not surprised, with a huge increase from one year to the next. So perhaps a limit of 3 or 4 or 5% on how much landlord can pass through from year to year. And can be very difficult to get, especially right now, given the more recent history of inflationary costs. Continuing on the letter of intent detail, percentage rent. This is really unique to retail, and the concept really is that landlords believe they should share in a percentage of the sales of the business that exceed a certain level of sales. The idea being that, especially in an inflationary period, sales keep going up and up, but if your rent is relatively fixed, the landlord should benefit because they're providing the environment for you to succeed. The larger the tenant, the stronger the tenant, the less common this is. When I was at Staples, I'd say less than 10% of our leases had a percentage rent clause. But for smaller tenants, certainly in malls in particular, it's very, very common. Almost every tenant will have them. And the way it works is most of them are what's known as a percentage of sales over what's a natural break point. What does that mean? So what it means is, so for example, if your rent is $100,000 a year and you're paying 5% over that natural break, you would have 100,000 divided by the 5%, which is $2 million of sales. So essentially up to 2 million in sales, you'd be paying just your base rent. And then for every dollar over the 2 million, you'd be sharing 5%, that landlord. Could also have what's known as an unnatural break point, in which the break point just set at a fixed number. So let's say it's 1.8 million for that tenant, and you're paying 5% over whatever that break point is that's agreed to. Typically, percentage rent is determined sort of by the type of retailer, based on the history of that retailer's profitability and the sales level. So your broker should have very good information as to what's typical for your business and your industry, so that you're not paying too much for percentage rent. And then just details that to try to limit what you pay would be to exclude from the calculation of sales things like returns from customers, internet sales, or employee sales. Next, the term of the lease and the options to renew. Touched on that before. And if you sign a 5-year lease, you should almost always be able to get a 5-year option, or if it's a 10-year lease, two 5-year options. And the option rent might be fixed, or it could be at fair market value with some sort of process outlined in the lease for how fair market value is going to be determined. An option to terminate is something, of course, a tenant may want, landlords resist, but for many tenants, that's something that they must have on a 10-year lease. And you say, well, if I'm not doing at least a certain amount of business after 5 years, or after 4 years, I'll give the landlord some notice, perhaps a year notice. I don't meet a certain sales threshold and terminate. And then there'll be quite a bit negotiated with the landlord as to how landlord might be compensated if that were to take place. But again, in today's environment, that's, I'd say, probably a lot less common than it was when the economy was weaker and a lot more retail space was available. Landlords were more accommodating to provide those. Delivery date and rent commencement dates, and not the same date. There shouldn't be. Typically, a landlord will agree to deliver to you by a certain date, and then you'll be able to negotiate a free rent period during which you'll be building out your space. Let's say, again, depending on the amount of construction involved, that should be at least 60 usually, and often 90 or even 120 days for much more significant investments. And ideally, very important, especially for businesses which may have challenges in getting approval for their use, is that there's a contingency for permits to open, permits to operate, permits to actually do the construction for your use. So that if for some reason you are unsuccessful in achieving permits, you're able to get out of the lease. And then finally, the delivery condition, LOI really should spell out, what you're getting, especially the heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. Is it new? Is it not going to be new? Are you accepting it as is condition no matter what? That's important, as HVAC can be very expensive if it's not in good condition. The availability of utilities and any landlord work that will be done as a condition of the acceptance of the space. The maintenance responsibilities, typically landlords doing virtually everything outside your premises, should be doing everything, especially keeping you dry. Roof in good condition, not leaking. structure of the building, the parking lot and landscaping, and virtually everything in the interior of the building would be by the tenant, although it's often the case a tenant is responsible to do their own serious snow removal and repair the HVAC, if not replace it. Ideally, you want to put some kind of cap on those costs for HVAC, especially if the equipment completely fails and needs to be replaced. And then my last point is, and David already touched on this, that landlords, especially for startups, are really going to want to understand the business and the people involved and what their capability is to pay the rent and to operate a successful business. So before you get too far down the path and looking at space, really need to put all these financial items in place, be prepared to provide them immediately as part of the LOI negotiation, as most landlords will not want to even sign an LOI until they feel comfortable with the viability of the tenant. Moving on. David.
Okay, now we get to the really fun part. First and foremost, as you see right at the top, get an attorney. Again, we will stress that. As you talk to attorneys, it's important to find the right attorney. That's the other side of this whole equation. You may have a cousin who specializes in wills and trusts and things like that. That cousin's not the right person to do a commercial lease if they don't have experience negotiating a commercial lease. Just because somebody is a lawyer doesn't mean they're the right lawyer for you as you look at negotiating a lease. You want to make sure they have commercial lease experience. And the other thing is to set parameters for the negotiation, because lawyers charge by the hour. And if you can get one to give you a flat fee for negotiating a lease, that's great. But since they do mostly charge by the hour, some lawyers have a tendency to negotiate everything to death. And you want to make sure that the lawyer isn't racking up billable hours negotiating things that aren't really that important. So you want to make sure you and your attorney agree on some parameters for how to negotiate the lease and how much money you expect to spend before any of that happens. So then let's go through some of the key terms within the lease, some of the things you're gonna be confronting. I mean, Bernie has touched on a lot of these because they are in the letter of intent typically, but the lease is going to spell out more details, and these details are important. So the first thing you want to do is verify that all the LOI terms that you've negotiated are actually incorporated correctly into the lease agreement. So when it says, here's the rent schedule, make sure the rent schedule is spelled out properly in the lease. Make sure that all the things you've negotiated in terms of who's supposed to do what, when, what the condition of the premises, various things are, that's all incorporated into the lease. So then let's go through the rest of these bullet points. Permitted and prohibited uses. We've talked about getting exclusivity of use, but one of the things that the landlord in the lease is going to have in there is what's prohibited for you to do in the lease. Now, this is important to have as broad as possible, because one of the things that landlords can trap tenants is by having a really narrowly defined permitted use clause in the lease. So that if the tenant then says, it's not working out for me, but I've got a sublease that I've got a subtenant that wants to take over the space, the landlord can say, you know what, no, because that's not the same use as what you've already agreed to do in the lease. So if that permitted use has very narrow windows around it, it makes it harder for you to pivot in your business, to find a new tenant for it, et cetera. So it's important to try to have that be as broad as possible in the actual lease language. Bernie talked about the percentage rent, so I won't go into that much, although one thing, just to go back to the letter of intent stage, one thing I've done as a landlord before is if I want to take a flyer on a new tenant, if I think, well, these people haven't been in business before, but I like the concept, I'm not going to be able to get as much base rent as I hope to with this tenant, but I think they're going to be successful. So I'll negotiate a lower base rent for them, but I'll use an artificial break point so that I start getting a percentage of their sales at an earlier point than if we used a natural break. So that's something that I've done before as a landlord. and you may have some success with landlords depending on, where you're looking, et cetera, and what type of landlord they are. Let's talk about condition of premises at the delivery. Bernie mentioned that a bit, but one of the things that's really important is to make sure that there's something in the lease agreement that has a process for how you can approve or reject what the condition of premises. You can't have it where the landlord just says, okay, I've done everything. And then you get in and start doing your work and find out that the things the landlord said they were going to do have not been done. So you need to have in your lease agreement some kind of process for you to say, no, you said you delivered this, you said you were going to deliver certain things and they have not been done. So I'm not accepting delivery right now. You have to fix the following items for me to accept delivery. And the most critical on that is HVAC system. A landlord is going to want to have you responsible for everything on an HVAC system. And they're going to want to say, it's your responsibility. So at a minimum, you're going to want to have in your lease agreement the ability to get an HVAC contractor or mechanic in to basically take a look at the unit and give you a sense of, is it going to last? Is it in good condition? Has the landlord been maintaining it, et cetera? A lot of times in a lease document, you can negotiate that you'll be responsible for the maintenance of the HVAC unit. The landlord will require you to enter into a maintenance contract, and you'll have to show the landlord a copy of that maintenance contract. But then assuming you've got a maintenance contract and it's being maintained properly, if a compressor goes, or if a condenser goes, or if the unit just blows completely, ideally that would be the landlord's responsibility, not up to you to replace it. I can tell you a lot of horror stories about tenants who get in, they take over a space, they didn't inspect it, they just think the system's working right, and then within 6 months they're looking at replacing an HVAC unit. That's a lot of money. You want to avoid that. Let's talk about options to renew. Ideally, one thing to remember is that an option only benefits the tenant. For a landlord, an option requires them to maintain a relationship with a tenant that they might not otherwise want to have. So landlords can be very difficult in negotiating options. One of the things you want to go through in the lease agreement, if it says it's a fair market value option, the lease should spell out in pretty good detail how that fair market value is determined. What you don't want to have is a situation where the landlord says, okay, I think the fair market value for renewal is $100 a foot. And he has no requirement to demonstrate how that was calculated. And there are leases that are written that way, that basically the tenant has no choice but to accept what landlord's determination is. So there needs to be a process in the lease that helps determine what fair market value is. The leases I used to work with typically would actually have a whole arbitration and appraisal section in the lease, where if the landlord said the space is worth $100 a foot and the tenant said, I don't think that's accurate, you would go to an arbitration process where brokers were retained by each party to jointly get together and determine if that was actually fair market or what fair market value should be. So that's important to have in the lease. You can't just have the landlord determine that. How long the notice period is important. As a tenant, you want that notice period as short as possible, because you don't want to be looking at a year notice for exercising your option to renew and then find out 6 months later that your business has had a downturn and things aren't working out. So you want that notice period to be as short as possible. The other thing is to be careful in the lease agreement for ways that the option can be lost. For example, in leases that I used to negotiate as a landlord, I would have in the lease that if a tenant ever defaulted on their lease because they didn't pay the rent on time or something else, that any option in the lease would be negated and would no longer be valid. That's a very difficult landlord-centric clause. We got a lot of pushback from smart tenants on it. From tenants that didn't pay attention, we didn't get any pushback. So I had some tenants that would lose their options because of that. And so you need to be careful to make sure there's if there's language in the lease about how an option might be negated, you want to be careful that there are really strict parameters around that, and you get the right to cure that problem and right to recapture the option, etc. Bernie talked about CAM charges, additional rent for operating expenses, taxes, etc. The lease will go into more detail about potential exclusions from your operating expense and CAM charges. Things that should absolutely be in there are things like the landlord's admin fees. You know, every LLC has to register with the state and pay $500 a year. You don't want to have to include that in your CAM charges. Any attorney fees that the landlord has should not be included in operating expenses. Ideally, any capital expenses should not be included in operating expenses. If there are capital expenses that the landlord insists have to be included, they should be amortized over a life cycle of the improvement. So for example, if the landlord puts on a new roof and unfortunately your lease says you're responsible for a portion of those costs, you should only be responsible for the appropriate amortization period of that roof. So typically that's going to be, I guess it's probably 30 years or 20 years. Every capital expense has a different amortization period, but you would be only responsible for, if it was a 20-year amortization, you'd only be responsible for 1/20th of the cost of that capital expense. We talked about caps and limits on expenses, just verifying that those are included in the lease. And it's important to go through. Most landlords are not going to give a blanket cap no matter what. You might be able to negotiate a cap on what are called controllable expenses. So for example, a landlord has no control over taxes, has no control over insurance costs, has no control over utilities, has no control over various snow removal. But they do have control over things like cleaning and maintenance and management fees, things like that. So ideally, you'd be able to get a cap on the exposure to increases in controllable expenses. Most leases are going to be set up so that you have to pay in advance for CAM charges. So they're going to say, okay, here's your base rent. Let's say it's $50 a foot. Your CAM charges we're estimating are going to be $10 a foot. So basically you're paying effectively $60 a foot. That's on an annual basis. So monthly it would be 1/12 of that. But there needs to be, if you're paying your CAM charges in advance, or your tax charges for that matter, there needs to be a settling up process spelled out in the lease for what the landlord has to do to say, okay, I charged you this much money for CAM charges, and now it turns out instead of $10 a foot, it was only $8 a foot. So now the landlord owes you $2 a foot as a credit because you overpaid over the course of the lease. There needs to be a process in the lease to spell out what happens next. You know, do they write a check to you? Do they just credit it against future rent payments? The flip side of all this is they may say it was $10 a foot and it turns out it was $12 a foot. So if that happens, what's the process for them charging you that extra $2 a foot? Do you have to pay that in a lump sum? Can they add it and spread it out over the next year's CAM payments? There's a lot of different ways to do it. The lease should spell that all out. And I saw a question, yes, CAM charges are typically going to be the same as triple net charges. Tenant construction, if you have construction that you have to do in your space, the lease is going to spell out a process for how that all works. And, you know, as Bernie said, you want some kind of contingency so that if you can't get construction done because you can't get a permit, you can't get approvals, et cetera, you want the right to terminate the lease. You don't want to be stuck in a lease agreement where you can't actually operate because you weren't able to get approvals. But assuming you get your approval, you obviously have to follow all the municipal requirements, but you're also going to have landlord requirements. Typically, that's going to involve sending them a set of plans. They might charge you some money to review the plans or have their architect or engineer review the plans. If they do, you want to cap how much that they can charge you on that. And the lease should also spell out the process for how long it takes. The landlord should not be able to get your plans and sit on them for too long. There should be a process where they have to either accept or reject the plans within a certain period of time. If they accept it, obviously then you move forward. If they reject it, there should be a process for what you have to do to change the plans to turn them back into the landlord and have them go through and accept them again or reject them again. But that process all needs to be spelled out in the lease, and it should be as quick as possible, but also recognizing that if you have to make changes to your plans, you're going to have to go back to your architect. The architect is going to have to redraw the plans. That takes some time. So you don't want the window of resubmitting plans to the landlord to be too quick. You want to make sure that it gives you enough time to actually have the plans redone. And then, your landlord is going to require that your improvement contractor has adequate insurance, that they name the landlord as an insured on their policy. You want that too. That's important for you to make sure your contractor has appropriate insurance and is appropriately licensed. So those are things to protect both of you, but the lease will spell that all out. Moving on to assignment and subletting. This is especially important when you decide you want to sell your business. Let's say you've opened up a store, it's been very successful, and now you want to sell it to somebody else. Is that going to be considered an assignment or a sublet under your lease agreement? It probably is. And in that case, you'll probably have to go to your landlord for approval of that assignment and sublet. And there's a lot of people who get into a situation where the language around the assignment and sublet clause is very tight and very landlord friendly and gives the landlord basically the approval for you to sell your business. So it's really important that the lease language reflect some flexibility for the landlord to not just arbitrarily say, no, I'm not going to allow this assignment of my lease. Because ultimately that's what you're selling is your lease agreement, your space, and because that's a key foundation of where your business is doing. So it's important to negotiate things like, what's the credit worthiness of the replacement tenant? It should be basically what yours was when the landlord agreed to sell, to lease the space to you. So if you get the landlord to agree to you leasing space when your net worth is $100,000, the landlord shouldn't be able to require that a replacement tenant who's going to buy your business have a net worth of $500,000. They shouldn't be able to do that in a way to restrict your ability to sell the business and assign it or sublease it to somebody else. The other bullet point here is partial sublet or space license. Just as Bernie talked about, that's an opportunity sometimes for new tenants to get into business by licensing space within a larger retailer. You might find that you want to sublease or license a piece of your space to another tenant. And ideally, you wouldn't have to get landlord approval on that. That's unlikely, but if the lease agreement contemplates that and says you have to get approval even if you're only subleasing a tiny piece of space. I'm getting a note saying I'm muted. Can people hear me?
I can.
Okay. So, ideally you don't have to get the landlord's approval if you license 100 square feet to another user. But if you are required to get approval from the landlord, it should spell out what the terms, how that approval happens and what you have to provide to the landlord to be able to do that. So maintenance responsibilities, we've talked about that, and we've talked about HVAC. The other thing, you are going to be responsible for everything in the interior of your space. That's going to be all on you. The other thing a lot of tenants don't understand going into retail spaces, you're going to also be responsible for the windows, the plate glass windows, and your entrance door and your lock going in. So for example, if you get broken into, you're going to be the one who's going to be responsible for getting the glass replaced, getting your door replaced, getting your lock replaced, etc. A lot of tenants, especially with large plate glass windows, they get insurance for that because you can get plate glass insurance.
One quick thing, Dave, just a
Yep.
quick time check. It's about 5:10, so I think we've only
Okay.
got 5 minutes left, and we got a lot more to cover.
We got a lot more to cover.
Yeah.
So I'll skip the insurance requirements. You are going to be required to insure all your own fixtures and your improvements that you've done. So landlord won't insure your own improvements. When you leave the lease at termination, there should be a process for what happens there. And the lease should spell out that, as well as if there's any damage, what the process is for you to restore the premises so you can get back in business. It should give you adequate time to do that. Under default, this is important because there's monetary default as well as non-monetary default. Obviously, monetary is if you don't pay your rent. You want to understand in the lease, and it should spell out when a default occurs. Does it occur after the landlord sends you notice, or does it occur without the landlord sending you any notice? And how long do you have to cure that default? Does it give you 5 days to cure it, 10 days, or no days? And then non-monetary default is if you break one of the rules or regulations in the lease, just what the process is for curing that. It should give you a much longer period of time to cure a non-monetary default. And you want to pay attention to what the fees and interests charges are that they're going to assess for any default, because that can add up very quickly to a lot of money, because they'll typically, a lot of leases will have both an admin cost as well as interest charges, and those interest charges are going to be high. I'm going to skip the rules and regs and talk about subordination and non-disturbance. This is important for any tenant, especially in this environment. It's basically an agreement that you will have with the landlord's lender that if the landlord gets foreclosed on, they will recognize your lease and not terminate it. If you don't have that clause in place in your lease and in between, and an agreement between you and the landlord's lender, if they foreclose, they can just terminate all the leases in the building. And so you could be out on the street, even though you have been a good tenant, had a perfectly valid lease, et cetera. Let's move to the next one. So I'm going to skip relocation provisions, just talk about what the condition of the premises is at termination. A lot of times that should be negotiated up in your lease. Ideally, the landlord should have to identify when they approve your plans, they should have to identify what they're going to want you to take out when you leave. You're going to have to take out your furniture and fixtures. That's typically a given, but the landlord may want you to restore it to a shell condition. They may want you to take out any improvements you've done. You want to be careful about that. Let's talk about permitting and approval considerations. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is in Boston because that's where most of my retail experience is, and that's where a lot of my clients have looked to lease space. The building department is the zoning enforcement office for any city or town. So that's the first place to go to understand what the process is to get approvals, what the timeline will be, et cetera. So in Boston, the process starts with you submitting a permit application to ISD, which is the technical word for the business department or the building department. Plans may be required for that. And for uses that aren't as of right, which would include any restaurant use, the application will be rejected and you'll get a referral to go to the zoning board of approval or zoning board of appeals. When you go to the ZBA, you're going to have a public hearing at City Hall. As part of that process, you're going to have to get support of the neighborhood, which means you may have to go through, like in Back Bay, you had to go and have a hearing at the Neighborhood Association of Back Bay for them to weigh in on your use. You'd have to get approval from the city councilor and you need the mayor's office behind you. Once the ZBA approves it, then you submit a more detailed application to ISD and to the fire department, who will also basically issue, because basically in Boston, there's 2 separate building permits you need, one from ISD and one from the fire department. And the key is the entire process always takes longer than you think it will. So as you're negotiating a lease, make sure you give yourself enough time that you'll be able to get your approval, work through the process, and not short circuit that because it's going to take longer than you think it will.
Okay. So moving on, construction. So you've been successful identifying a space, negotiating a letter of intent. While you're in the process of either your letter of intent or lease negotiation, you're going to want to start looking for and lining up a contractor. And in fact, you may want a contractor to help you in that process, as we'll get into in some detail. So first, need to understand there's a difference between general contractors that oversee the entire job and the subcontractors that work under the GC They would be, those that do, the specialists who do electrical work, HVAC or plumbing or flooring. Then they're the suppliers who do nothing but sending materials or equipment to you. Each of them have an important role, and you may be dealing only with the GC, or you may be dealing with all three, depending on how you've structured the contract. You want to make sure any contractor you choose is, of course, licensed, insured properly, and check them out with the Better Business Bureau. Architects and brokers are great for recommending GCs, obviously other businesses, people have worked with contractors as well. Checking references, can't emphasize this enough. No matter what anybody else says, how good somebody is, you want to talk to people who this contractor's done work for before and ask them specifically, how many times have they given you changes, budget changes after they signed the contract? Were they fair? I mean, some change orders are fair, but sometimes they're not. Were they on budget? Were they on schedule? And again, especially with regard to like restaurants or businesses that are going to have very high-end quality finish work, like mill work, you're going to want a contractor who's done that level of work before. You don't want somebody who for the first time is building out a restaurant. It's just too much unique work involved, typically in that type of construction. And then, always carry an appropriate contingency for anything unforeseen, especially an older building where you just can't really do enough evaluation up front. If it's a brand new building, completely wide open, even then you might still find there's unexpected changes that you may come up with during the process of building out your space. You just may change your mind and want to do something differently. And then strongly recommend getting a GC involved in the budgeting estimating process while you're doing your initial design, because the GC could help you reduce those costs by providing ideas that would help you save some money.
I would also add, the city of Boston can be very difficult to work through permitting, et cetera. So not only is it important to have a contractor who knows how to do the type of build out that you're looking for, but if you're going to be in Boston, have a contractor who knows how to get through the city, because working with ISD can be quite difficult. And if somebody is coming in from the suburbs and doesn't have experience in Boston, that can add a lot of time and a lot of cost.
Right. There are a number of different ways to structure contracts. Probably most common, what everybody would assume, probably if they were without prior knowledge, is that you just want to bid out to multiple GCs and have them provide you a guaranteed price. Most guaranteed price contracts still would have exclusions potentially for things that are outside of contractors' control, delays in materials that are outside their control, or there may be allowances, that you're allowed X dollars per square foot for materials, and then you might choose something that's more expensive. And so that's the most common way. If you have time to bid out and have multiple contractors you think are all qualified, you'll probably get the best, very good price that way. And design build is another option, though, especially if it's somebody you've worked with before or specializes in design build. And the idea is that a contractor also has design capability in-house or works closely with an architect, and they can provide a faster solution for you, so you don't have weeks of bidding out. Time may be worth more than anything else. For example, when you want to get open by a certain date, that may be the best and fastest way to achieve that. Construction management is a different approach in which essentially you're hiring the contractor for a fixed amount of money. Maybe just a fixed dollar amount or a fixed percentage of what you anticipate the cost of the project is. And then the contractor is going to go out and bid out the project to subcontractors and suppliers, and just work effectively with you to try to get the best possible subcontracts and supply costs and effectively manage the project for a fee. That's more common in larger projects, frankly, but it is an option. The owner could also, you could directly purchase some materials, because general contractors typically going to mark them up by 10% or more, just for the for having that responsibility. The downside of that is that, you're at that point, you're going to be responsible in making sure those materials are on site when they need to be, and that the accuracy of the materials that you've ordered is correct. So if a contractor shows up and is not able to do the work because materials aren't there or you ran out, that's going to be on you. You'll end up paying a change order to the contractor. The contract you use could be simple. Seen it done multiple ways. For more, certainly larger, more complex projects, it's very common to use what's known as an AIA form, which is an architectural organization that publishes standard forms that are used. One of the nice things about those is that they're widely accepted, so it makes the process of negotiating contract generally faster. You still want to have an architect and an attorney and architect involved in helping you negotiate that contract. You want to make sure your contract includes progress payment schedule. So the last thing you want is to be paying your contractor more than is necessary at each stage of the project. You don't want to have the contractor, for example, getting 75% of the contract paid out when they've only done 40 or 50% of the work. And most contracts have a holdback, meaning the final 10% at least of the project is not paid out until all their subcontractors and suppliers have been paid and provided known as lien releases, which guarantees that they won't file a lien for non-payment. So the general contractor stiffs a subcontractor supplier, the first thing that they're going to do is put a lien on your property, and that's going to tie you up. And that's actually can be a default in your lease if you have a lien on that building. The landlords don't like that.
Yeah, no, that will definitely be a default.
Right. And then finally, an architect is often hired as the owner's representative to really make sure that you are only paying what you should be paying on the project. Strongly recommend that, especially for more complex projects. Last thing I want to just say before we take some questions is, and I'm asked this a lot, I mean, what's negotiable? The bottom line is virtually everything in a lease is negotiable. And how much is negotiable obviously depends all about who is the leverage. Stronger tenants certainly have a lot more leverage than landlords, but even the strongest tenants, a small tenant in a big office building may have little or no leverage. Question is, how important is your particular space, your particular deal, your company to that landlord at that time? But it doesn't hurt to ask for everything that's important to you, even if you're going to get turned down 75% of the time. You're going to get some things that you might not expect to get, even if you're a first-time tenant. So should definitely, I'd say, be relatively aggressive to start in every negotiation, see what you can get. Any last words, David, before we take some questions?
No, I think let's see if there are any questions.
Okay.
Can you go to the next slide? It should be hopefully that. Yeah. So, we went through it really fast. Anyway, I just want to remind everyone that if you want to talk to a SCORE mentor, you can go to the score.org website, put in your zip code and get matched to the chapter nearest you. If you would like to meet with Bernie or David because you have a question about something they specifically talked about today, you can email me and I will get you a meeting with them at outreach@scoreboston.org. It's outreach@scoreboston.org. So questions. First question. I am unfamiliar with what a co-working concept might be. Can you give an example?
Yeah, I know. I'm not all that familiar with them. I think this is a new thing that's happening. I know they're down in the Seaport area in Boston. There are people that have basically rented space that they then bring in smaller retailers, almost like a space license agreement, but they bring in a bunch of smaller retailers to create sort of a little market area within a piece of space that they lease. I can't give you really any more specifics than that because this is a new concept. I mean, co-working has been a concept in office space for quite some time now. but it's just starting to come to retail. It works for landlords because, you know, they get somebody to lease a chunk of space for them, and then that person takes on the responsibility of bringing in the smaller tenants that might then co-work within that space. There are other co-working examples where it's almost like a retail co-op, where you go in, everybody has space within a larger piece of space, and as part of your agreement there, you'll agree to work the cash register for certain periods of time for all the tenants in there. There's different ways that I've seen of that. But quite honestly, that's as much familiarity as I have with that use. I never had any tenants that did that.
Okay. Then the rest of these questions kind of came in throughout, so you may have touched on some of these things, but I think they're definitely always worth going back over. What about signage? For example, a franchise that has specific signage and requirement restrictions, how would
Right.
that factor in?
Typically, you're going to have to get both landlord and municipality approval for your signage. And oftentimes the landlord requirements are a lot more strict than the town requirements are. But you know, the landlord requirements might involve how big it is, whether it's lit, what materials are used. They'll require you typically, I mean, I would always require somebody to submit plans for what the sign was going to look like. Most of the time, there are sign companies that will do that all for you as a tenant. You don't have to worry about, if you hire a sign company to produce your sign, they'll generate all the required materials for both the city and for the landlord.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the sign ordinances can vary tremendously from place to
Yeah.
place. So the size of the letters that you might get on the building, you can't assume, even if you see a sign down the street that's large on a building, that you're going to get the same thing. As ordinances can change over time. They can vary based on the width of your space. So you really do need an experienced sign company. And you know, not uncommon actually to make a lease contingent on getting approval for a variance.
Yeah.
For a sign.
Yeah.
Or for an extra sign. So if you say, well, I absolutely need a sign that's on the side of the building, not just the front because it's visible from a highway or something, you can make that a condition of the transaction and make, you know, have them go to the zoning board and try to make a case that you need that sign.
Right. But do that in the letter of intent phase, not in the
Right.
not in the lease phase. That's something you don't want to be bringing. Your lease is, if you need to have a sign and it's contingent on getting that sign, you need to make sure it's in the LOI.
Yeah.
Okay, how do we go about looking for a broker? And how long before a desired open date should you start a search?
Well, let's see. The latter question, I'd say it depends on your use. You know, if you're looking to open a restaurant in the city of Boston, you should give yourself, you know, maybe as long as a year. Maybe not that much, but you should give yourself a long time. If you're looking to open up a used clothing store, it's not going to take you that much time. So, you know, if a restaurant, you should say a year to 9 months. I'd say for, you know, some less complicated uses, probably, you know, 3 months to 6 months. Bernie, you probably have more experience on this than I do.
Yeah, well, let me put it this way, just as an example, I'm working with a franchise concept right now. Small spaces, not that complicated, and I'm anticipating it's going to be anywhere from 6 to 12 months to open a store from the point at which I have a site that's been approved and a letter of intent signed. Because process of negotiating a lease, designing a space, getting permits and building. And the permit process in some cities, even for a regular building permit with no change of use, because of COVID, has really slowed down. So you can be waiting 60, 90 days for a permit that used to take a matter of weeks. So
yeah, I mean,
research up front in each location to find out what the timing is likely to be. So,
you know, I mean, a lot of retailers want to open for Christmas. So, for example, you're too late right now. I mean, you're probably too late.
Right.
Are landlords willing to work directly with a potential tenant? So
Oh,
that you,
God, yes. You mean, and not have a broker involved?
and not have a broker, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I don't advise it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I was a tenant that that's the right way to go, because a good broker will add value. They'll help you understand if you're paying too much or what the landlord typically does when they negotiate a lease, because they've worked with the landlord before. So a good broker can add a lot of value, but yes, I mean, as a landlord, I loved it when tenants came directly, because they didn't have all the information that they otherwise would have.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to pay a fee.
Okay. Are you required to pay rent during a build out process?
Sometimes. Often you can negotiate for the free rent period I mentioned before for base rent, but you may be required to pay certainly utilities as soon as
Yeah.
you have control of the space, and often the common maintenance and other occupancy costs you might be paying during the build out. But again, subject to negotiation, no question.
It's all negotiable. I mean, ideally you don't, but depending on the landlord situation and how confident they are, they're going to get the space lease, you might have to.
Okay. And I think this is the last question because I found it in chat and sometimes we can lose track of the ones in chat, but are there regulations on lease agreements for build outs for business space?
Not sure what that means.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
I mean,
Maybe that
yes.
person can give us a little bit more information on that. But actually we are getting ready to wrap up things. So I don't think there's any more questions in chat. So if we missed your question, again, go ahead and send me an email to outreach@scoreboston.org and I can forward that question to Bernie and David to get you an answer. Or you can reach out to me to meet with a mentor, or again, score.org to meet with the mentor in your chapter area. So thank you everyone for joining us. Especially thank you to Bernie and David for an information-packed session. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great weekend because we're almost there. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.